Now, based on the popularity of my last video comparing modern shooting games guns to their real-life counterparts, I decided to tackle another title that I've personally spent entirely too much time playing, PlayerUnknown's BattleGrounds, aka PUBG. For those of you not in the know, PlayerUnknown's BattleGrounds is a first/third-person shooter developed by Bluehole Interactive that pits either a small group, either a 4-man group or a 2-man group, or an individual in a virtual deathmatch against 99 opponents. This type of scenario has come to be known as a Battle Royale game. While PUBG didn't invent the concept of a Battle Royale title, it was the first widely successful one with over 33 million copies sold. Now this is amazing in its own right, but it's even more impressive when you realize the entire project was spearheaded by Brendan Green, whose only previous experience in game design came from modifying a popular zombie game, DayZ, which itself started as a mod for the military shooter Arma. Now given Green's experience with the simulator Arma, one would assume that his brainchild, PUBG, would feature several realistic firearms with realistic damage models. So, does it? Let's take a closer look at some of the guns of PUBG and find out. Now this next rifle has unfortunately received quite a nerf in the last patch, along with basically all the other ARs, and maybe some of you at home who are experts can guess based on this magazine, also known as a Stanag. That's right, it's the M16A4. Now this model is a BCM semi-automatic clone, but still, like the real M16, features a 20-inch barrel and is chambered in 5.56 by 45mm. It is an incredibly light shooting gun, incredibly lightweight firearm, and utilizes direct impingement and a linear design to make the recoil forces have very little effect on the shooter. Now, this is something that a lot of games get right initially and then usually nerf, because the reality of it is the M16 has so many advantages over other firearms that in a video game, if you were to make them exactly how they really are, the AR series of rifles would dominate everything else. Still, let's see how it compares to the in-game model, but first, check out this light recoil on this 20-inch gun firing standard mil-spec ammunition. Doesn't even move. Not to mention, look how fast these reloads can be. The gun runs like greased lightning. Almost no recoil, lightning fast reloads, and lightweight construction means this thing should absolutely dominate. Unfortunately, that's not quite the case in PUBG. Let's take a closer look. Now I've only had a few chances to shoot the real-life NFA restricted M16 with its 3-round burst option, so instead I'll compare it to an M16A4 pattern semi-automatic only AR-15 from Bravo Company Machine, or BCM. Now just like its real-life counterpart, the M16A4 in PUBG features a flat-top, Picatinny railed receiver for mounting optics, a threaded muzzle, and accepts Stanag magazines. The in-game version starts with a 30-round standard magazine and can be upgraded to 40-round extended versions. Now while the game does not allow players to use 100-round giant beta drums or mount super high magnification optics, these changes weren't made for realism purposes, but rather for balancing. And at the very least, the M16A4 in-game is modeled very realistically. But what about performance? If you saw my video on Far Cry 5, you might remember some of my concerns with the guns in that game was that their bullet velocities were unrealistically slow, and that these velocities were totally the same regardless of caliber, and they were unchanging, basically constant throughout its flight. But in real life, bullets lose velocity as they travel and are unsurprisingly very fast. Now PUBG does a fantastic job in this regard. For example, the M16A4 in-game has an initial bullet velocity or muzzle velocity of 900 meters per second, only 60 meters per second slower than 62 grain ammunition fired from a real 20-inch barreled M16. Furthermore, the rounds decelerate as they travel, which makes hitting moving targets just as tricky in-game as in real life. This is one of the main reasons the M16 in PUBG is useful despite lacking a fully automatic mode, and inflicting less damage per shot than, say, a DMR. Its high bullet velocity means not having to lead or compensate for drop as much on distant or moving targets. The one aspect of the game that PUBG doesn't get right is the amount of damage it inflicts on unarmored and lightly armored targets. For instance, it requires 2 headshots to incapacitate a target wearing a simple bike helmet, and only inflicts lethal head damage to an unarmored target at 65 meters or less. Unfortunately for the recipients of the round, very few people can say they've been shot in the skull with an M16 at any distance and live to tell the tale.
Overall, the M16A4 in PUBG is a mostly realistic depiction of the gun and its capabilities. I'm gonna give it a solid A.
Now this next rifle is the latest gun to be added to PUBG's impressive arsenal of weaponry. You guessed it, the SLR. Chambered in 7.62 by 51 NATO, the SLR in-game is, of course, the FN-FAL, or the right arm of the free world. This gas piston operated semi-automatic and in certain configurations fully automatic battle rifle is amazing. It hits like a ton of bricks, both in real life and in PUBG. Let's take it for a spin and see how it runs compared to the in-game model. You'll notice I've got a flash hider on the end right now. That's a Silencer Co. Saker ASR flash hider provided by Silencer Shop, and we'll see how that does. But of course, what SLR would be complete? Now the two most important additions you can make to this rifle. That's right, the 6X, and of course, a sound suppressor. This one being a Silencer Co. Saker 7.62 provided by Silencer Shop. So this adds a tremendous amount of weight to the rifle, and we'll see how that runs. Now thankfully, the FAL series has an adjustable gas system, and when running a sound suppressor, that is absolutely critical. Otherwise, the gun can overgas itself and become very unreliable. So let's see how she runs with the addition of a 6X and a sound suppressor. Awesome. Amazing. Truly is one of the most badass weapons on the planet. Digital or the real life thing. Now let's see how it compares to the in-game model.
This hard-hitting battle rifle is emblematic of Western military small arms design of the 1950s when it was introduced. It fires a hard-hitting 7.62 by 51 NATO round from a full-sized rifle with a full-length barrel. It is the classic battle rifle. Eventually, guns like the SLR were phased out by lighter weight rifles and carbines firing faster, lighter ammunition. But these blasters of a bygone era still shine on the battlefield today as DMRs, outranging 5.56 carbines and turning light cover into Swiss cheese. In PUBG, the SLR is a decently accurate representation of the real-life weapon. The bullet velocity is spot on, the animations are accurate, though they lack some of the oomph necessary to rock stubborn magazines in place, but the magazines themselves aren't entirely accurate. The standard capacity magazines for the SLR only holds a scant 10 rounds, yet no military ever issued an FAL in any configuration with a 10-round magazine. In fact, they always use the standard 20-round magazine. Truthfully, the extended FAL magazines normally hold 30 rounds, but for balance purposes, Bluehole chose to make the extended versions 20 rounds, but I can understand given how powerful the weapon is. As far as optics mounting, the SLR in-game utilizes a rail dust cover that bears more than a passing resemblance to that made by DSA, which is the only solid mounting solution currently available. Now the only letdown of the SLR is that currently in PUBG there are no bullet penetration physics, so hiding behind drywall or a tiki hut will provide ample solid cover against 308. Overall, the SLR in PUBG is a pretty accurate representation of the FAL, at least in terms of aesthetics. That said, the strange decision to make the standard capacity magazine for the rifle only 10 rounds, and the fact that its 308 or 7.62 51 NATO rounds are incapable of penetrating even the lightest of cover, means this representation of the FN-FAL in PUBG doesn't really live up to its real-life counterpart. Now this next gun is one of my favorite guns in game, the SKS. Now this example is a Chinese-made Type 57, and it is inside of a Tapco stock, which is black instead of the tan/earth-colored one featured in game. Now, as far as why the guys at Bluehole would choose to put the SKS in this stock is debatable, but no military units would ever field the Tapco stock. It's not a terrible stock. I'm a purist, man. It needs to have wood. But as you can see, I've got the reflex sight on top, the hollow sight, which is an EOTech 550 series, and I'm using Tapco's extended 20-round magazines. So let's give it a spin and see how it compares to the in-game version.
Now, it's kind of weird because this gun was never designed for detachable magazine. You can tell because, I mean, look at this portion they had to add onto the front of it to make it actually function correctly. The original SKS uses an integral 10-round magazine, which is made of steel. It's infinitely more reliable than the 20-round polymer magazine, but does offer a lot more capacity. Now, one of the odd things in addition to this in PUBG is the fact that this weapon is considered, wow, I can't get to feed, is considered a DMR, which it is in no sense, way, shape, or form.
Sure, the SKS's use of a short stroke piston-driven action should make the gun more accurate than the long stroke-driven AK. And in fact, it does have an extra 4 inches of barrel, squeezing a little more velocity out of the round. Still, the SKS is never really capable of grouping better than 4 minutes of angle or 4 inches at 100 yards.
Now, let's go further in and really examine the point-by-point differences between this and the in-game model.
While the developers got a lot of things right with the last few guns we discussed, the same cannot be said for the SKS-45. For those of you that don't know, SKS-45 is an acronym for Samozayardny Karabin Sistema Simonova, or Self-Loading Carbine Simonov System of 1945. Now, the SKS is a semi-automatic internal magazine-fed carbine chambered in 7.62 by 39mm, the same round as the AKM. Despite this, the SKS is categorized as a DMR, or Designated Marksman's Rifle, in PUBG. Historically, the term DMR is applied to rifles used by specialized infantry that bridges the gap between standard infantry rifles or carbines and sniper rifles. Red flag number 1. While the SKS is in fact more accurate than the AKM, although only moderately, it is not a designated marksman's rifle, as it has essentially the same effective range, as it fires the same round from a similarly length barrel. And don't even get me started on the stock, the infamous Tapco Intrafuse. Sure, the Intrafuse adds a good amount of modularity to the SKS, but it has enough drawbacks that it would never be employed on a long-range DMR type weapon. Red flag number 2. What do I mean? The railed handguard physically moves up to a 1/16 of an inch side to side, and thus can't hold any semblance of a proper zero. Under battlefield conditions with mil-spec ammo, the gun's more of a 4 MOA gun. Combine that with its lackluster bullet velocity, and you have a relatively inaccurate gun whose rounds travel too slowly to reliably engage moving targets. Hardly a solid candidate for a DMR. But the inaccuracies don't end there. The SKS in-game also utilizes one of the least reliable magazines for the SKS, the Tapco Intrafuse polymer magazine. While it's fair to argue that incorporating things like reliability into a survival game would be more frustrating than fun, though you have to wonder why Bluehole didn't simply put an SVD in-game. You know, one of the original DMRs, some argue the original DMR, rather than a rifle that is considered by most experts as outdated the day it rolled off the assembly line. Well, at least the bullet velocity of the SKS is fairly accurate in-game at 800 meters per second, compared to its real-life 735 meters per second. Overall, I give it a solid C. The gun doesn't really belong in-game in its current state. If anything, it should be a side grade to the AK, maybe a slightly more accurate version of the AK, that's limited by capacity, as well as the fact that it's semi-automatic only, not a DMR.
Overall, PUBG is a pretty solid game, both from a fun standpoint and from a technical aspect. It's by no means a simulation, but the weapons are decently close and far closer than the vast majority of shooters on the market today. That said, the game is far from perfect, and stuff like desync and netcode issues still plague the game now 2 years after release. But if you can look past these couple of blemishes, you'll no doubt have a great time pursuing the infamous chicken dinner. Thanks guys. For TFBTV, I'm Jim Grant. And before I go, I wanted to say a special thank you to a couple of folks who helped me with this video, because to be honest, I played it well past the point of being fun to get all the footage I needed. So thank you all. This was not possible without your help. You made me look like I'm an actually good player when the truth is a little far from that. Thanks guys.